the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It can provide authoritative guidance. We are hoping that it can provide a new avenue to make some change, to break through the inertia that we experience in trying to talk about climate injustice.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
So next week we have the biggest ever set of hearings at the ICJ, the most states.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. I mean, we've seen huge hearings over the last couple of years at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, where it's kind of waded into the interpretation of the Genocide Convention and also into, it was an advisory opinion on Israel's occupation and the kind of responsibilities of states in certain things, a ton of attention. So what are you focusing on this time?
Well, this time the focus is on climate. It's one of the biggest issues facing the world, and the ICJ is finally going to say something about it.
Why? Why is the ICJ involved?
Well, Vanuatu, one of the small island states, asked the UN General Assembly for an advisory opinion, and over 100 states and organizations have weighed in and written opinions, and 98 states and 12 international organizations will present their oral arguments from Monday, December the 2nd, onwards for a couple of weeks.
Oh, my goodness. Steph, it sounds like you're going to be incredibly busy. Are you going to be there every day?
I'm going to divide my time between the World Court and the ICC Assembly of State Parties. So it's going to be me shuttling from court to court, probably looking like one of those dogs that pops up going squirrel, 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 squirrel between those courts.
And should we read out some of the operative bits of the resolution? Why don't you take the first bit, Steph, what they're going to be discussing?
Yeah, so the question that the court has been asked to answer is, what are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for states and for present and future generations?
And B, what are the legal consequences of those obligations, including particularly for small island developing states, especially affected, especially vulnerable, quote unquote, for present and future generations?
So joining us to explain the idea behind these hearings and what the expectations are and maybe a bit of insight in the strategy is Vanuatu's Special Envoy on Climate Change, Ralph Regenvanu. Hi, Ralph.
Hi, nice to be on your show.
So, Ralph, we see an enormous number of states are going to appear in December at the ICJ. Is that heartening to you, or is it maybe a bit worrying because maybe different states have very different opinions, very different from Vanuatu?
I think it's great. I really think it's great that this is the case, the ICJ's hearing for an advisory opinion that has the most number of states ever. And I think it's a reflection of the existential nature of the climate crisis and the fact that we are not really addressing it as we should based on the scientific evidence. We're not taking the actions that are necessary. And so many states, I think, realize this and are coming to the court almost as a last resort if we can't get the outcomes we need to save our planet through the United Nations Conference of the Parties process, which just finished in Baku last week and was a good example actually of the fact that we cannot get the outcomes we're looking for. We need to go to the ICJ, for example, to give us an advisory opinion that can help us take another tack perhaps on the issue of dealing with the climate crisis.
So now you are in a privileged position because you have seen, maybe I think Vanuatu as a state has seen some of the oral arguments that are made, and we as journalists have not, because they're not yet made public by the court, only on the first day of hearings. Can you say something about which way the arguments are tending that you've seen?
Basically, there are the arguments saying that the Paris Agreement that was came out of the UNFCCC process, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is these COPs that we hear about. In 2016, the Paris Agreement in Paris and the Paris COP is one of the arguments is that this agreement is what countries have committed to when it comes to dealing with climate change. And this is everything that we need to concern ourselves with when we talk about climate change. This is the only agreement that matters for states. And the opposite argument, which is the argument that Vanuatu is making, is that in fact, all international law, in effect, identifies obligations of states, how they should interact in the international community, what their obligations and responsibilities are, and what the consequences of not acting are. And so even back to the establishment of the United Nations, the UN Charter, this is the first set of obligations that all states agreed to, right? To cooperate in an international order for the benefit of humanity's future. And so starting there, moving on to things like the covenants on political and civil rights, Convention on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, I mean, all of these things have obligations when it comes to ensuring a viable and positive future for the humans that inhabit this world and, of course, the environments they depend on. And so that is the opposite argument, that international law on climate change is, in fact, multifaceted, incorporates numerous institutions of international law, including conventions, including customary law. And it's not just confined to this Paris Agreement. That's basically the two sides of the argument.
I'm just going to say for people that we're recording this interview via Zoom, so it may be that some of your words, Ralph, gets stretched a little by the Zoom quality, but we think it's really important enough to do it, and we'll do our best to make sure it comes across really well to the listeners in the end. Now, from what you've just said, I get the idea of why it is that you've gone to the International Court of Justice, because, there's your highest authority in the world on international law. But I'm also wondering whether kind of Vanuatu has approached the International Court of Justice because of you're a very small state, you're a small island state, and this kind of helps. It gives you a space for power. I mean, the reason why I say that is because you'd said previously that it's a platform where we small island states can overcome the power of wealthy countries with the authority of international law. Is that how you see it?
Yes, obviously we've been engaged in the United Nations Framework on Climate Change meetings for 30 years now, the UNFCCC process. And obviously we're very frustrated with that process because we're seeing groups of countries form and basically stifle action that the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the preeminent scientists in the world advising the international community through the United Nations on what the science is that requires us to take this action to, for example, limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We've seen the IPCC warnings coming out saying, we're way off track. We need to take more action. We need to phase out fossil fuel use. We need to provide finance. But we're not seeing that reflected in the outcomes of the COPs. And this last one was another good example of that, just maybe another bad example of that. And so the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It can provide authoritative guidance on some of these legal questions because of its general jurisdiction. It's not limited to specific treaties, and it can provide an overview of what the obligations of states are, knowing the science, knowing that we've been negotiating in this space for many, many years, decades, in fact. We are hoping that it can provide a new avenue to make some change, to break through the inertia that we experience in trying to talk about climate injustice, and actually provide some rulings that will, for example, declare that cumulative emissions which cause global heating which is causing the climate change we're experiencing now, is in fact unlawful, given all the international conventions and rules and principles and basically the founding principles of the United Nations as an international community trying to work to enhance human rights and human well-being for all people all across the globe.
And your counsel in this case has said before that the intended outcome of the advisory opinion would be setting a different paradigm that makes climate change contribution unlawful. And you yourself have said that you're confident that the ICJ's opinion will become the guiding star. I understand in a way, the outcome you're looking for, declaring this contribution unlawful. Is there more that you want out of this? And how do you expect states will react to that?
Well, as we know, ICJ advisory opinions, the implementation of them depends entirely on states. And we've seen that with the recent advisory opinions on what's happening in Israel and Palestine, for example, and other advisory opinions that have come out. And many states, of course, some of the main states that we see these kind of actions that we want to challenge are, in fact, not members of the ICJ. But just 2 months ago, we saw the new incoming government of the United Kingdom basically agreeing to the ICJ advisory opinion on giving back the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, right? Which that was a decision which came out back in 2019, and so it shows that with political will, we can achieve what advisory opinions advise the world community to do, and it still is ICJ is the principal judicial organ and can provide this authoritative guidance on legal questions that apply to all countries and all courts at all levels in all countries in a way that no other court can.
I wanted to ask you more about this idea of justice and injustice, because I saw something you'd written that this is the moment to require countries to recognise and correct the injustice of the climate crisis. I mean, what is that bigger picture of injustice? Because here I am, I'm in the comfortable global north, and with my lights all on, and I'm one of those people probably who's benefited from maybe the long-term injustice of the system. But just tell me how you see it from your perspective.
Well, my country, for example, Vanuatu, is a very small archipelagic state made up of about 80 islands in the Southwest Pacific Ocean. And we have contributed 0.0 something % of greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. Nothing like the amount of emissions that have been produced by the global north, the historical emitters, the ones that were involved in the Industrial Revolution and colonization and were able to, as a result, greatly advance their economies. Vanuatu, with contributing less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions, we are now facing some of the worst impacts as small island states. We're seeing the slow impact of sea level rise, which for some Pacific states, the low-lying ones like Tuvalu and Kiribati, the prediction is they will be gone. They'll be under the water because they are atoll states. The highest ground in those countries is perhaps 2 meters above sea level. Vanuatu is a high country. We're mountainous, but we're seeing some of the increasing intensity and frequency of tropical cyclones, which are causing massive damage. I mean, our first Category 5 cyclone we ever experienced was back in 2015, and that single cyclone cost us over 60% of our GDP in terms of the costs of responding and recovering. And these are things we cannot deal with because we don't have the financial capacity as one of the developing countries of the world. I really do think that these, natural hazards, these very intense climate emergency things like earthquakes, like floods, we're seeing them all over the world in all countries. And the difference is some of the richer countries can actually respond and build back, build more resilient, recover, which is something because of our lower financial capacity, because of our situation our structural situation in the world system. We don't have that. So what we're saying is that the countries that caused the climate change that we are now experiencing and suffering from and having to build back and respond to should play a part in providing the finance we need to respond. They've managed to build up their economies through exploiting fossil fuels, which have caused the climate crisis. So now, as the rich countries of the world, we need to see some sort of assistance to the developing countries who didn't cause climate change but are experiencing massive damage. This phrase of loss and damage that we're seeing now being very prevalent. And this is a principle that all countries actually agreed upon in Paris. It's part of the Paris Agreement that the developed countries will provide this amount of money that can be used by the developing countries. But unfortunately, we've never seen that commitment met. And that is one of the things about that we keep going to the COPs to talk about, is that we need to see this commitment that we've all agreed upon, that we need to correct the injustice by this financial remedy, as well as, of course, phasing out fossil fuels, which cause the crisis. We need to see these things happen. And we're not seeing them happen through the COPs. And so this is one of the reasons we're at the court, to see if we can get the justice that we're looking for provided in an advisory opinion from the ICJ.
Before we turn to talk about the COP, this recent COP, and ask you something about that, I wanted to pick at a particular thread that you also mentioned here. You spoke about the Chagos advisory opinion. And when you spoke before in a panel I was listening to, you also spoke about the decolonization argument in that case. And I was wondering, are there other aspects of how that case, how these arguments have inspired your case?
Well, I mean, the obvious one is that this was a tiny, small island developing state that took this case against one of the most powerful nations in the world, the UK. And we were privileged, Vanuatu, to be able to make a submission to the ICJ. It was, in fact, the first time that Vanuatu had appeared before the ICJ in support of Mauritius's case. And it just gave us a reminder that international law or law in general, shouldn't care about the power of the respective applicants or applicant and defendant. They should enforce principles of law. And that's what happened in this case. One of the smallest nations in the world was able to get a judgment saying that it has a right it was arguing for, that in fact this right does exist. The ICJ provided clarity and provided for the return of the sovereignty of the Chagos to Mauritius. And it's really given us hope that we can go to the ICJ and get a judgment that is really one that reflects the idea that justice is blind. It doesn't care who's before it. It just makes decisions on the issues and the law at hand.
You've already mentioned the disappointing COP that's just finished in Baku several times, and I read that your line, which I'll just repeat back to you, is that the decisions were not enough and they were never going to be enough. Based on our experience and pledges in the past, we know that they won't be fulfilled. Can you just give a little bit more understanding for me of what do you think is the relationship between the COPs and this ICJ ruling? Would you expect there to be, in some form, out of the ICJ, some kind of pressure that you could take to the next COP? Would it actually be something where you would say the ICJ says, and therefore Paris needs to be amended, or you need to do this? I mean, is there something, what's the tangible link there?
I think the ICJ advisory opinion will provide greater legal clarity and, of course, moral authority the next time we go to the COP, wherever it's going to be next year. We will have, hopefully, certain arguments that are made by the ones that are, holding back action. We hope to have certain of those arguments actually removed that can no longer be made because the court has said you can't talk about For example, climate finance. You cannot talk about climate finance as being private sector schemes like carbon credits and so on. It has to be actually public funds provided. So we're hoping that legal clarity can provide it so we can start to eliminate some of the arguments that are being made to stifle the kind of outcomes we want. And also, I think we will be in a different paradigm where the action of causing cumulative emissions that cause significant harm to the environment and to people in all over the world is actually unlawful in international law. And I think that should have the effect of changing the direction of discussions. And that's very much what we're looking for. We're looking for some sort of breakthrough in talking about climate change that sort of says, it's what the Secretary General of the United Nations has been saying for many years, that this is actually actions that, according to international law, are unlawful, are not following the rule of international law, and need to be stopped.
Do you have any top tips for which countries we should be watching out for, monitoring when we listen to the court hearings? This podcast is listened to by a lot of kind of legal geeks who are possibly not always into the crossing over into climate change. So what are the kind of innovative arguments that you see, apart, of course, from that we're all going to listen to Vanuatu on day one?
Exactly. That's just what I was going to say. I mean, Vanuatu kicks it off, so you'll set the tone. But who else are we going to listen to?
I think on the opposing side, we're going to have countries like the UK making arguments, although with the latest change in government, that may change. I'm just recalling back to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea advisory opinion, which was handed down in May. That was another case where a number of small island states, including Vanuatu, went to the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, which is established under the UNCLOS, and asked for an advisory opinion on the obligations of states. And in that context, we got a very good advisory opinion. We're very happy with it. It sets a good precedent for the upcoming ICJ decision. In that context, we were able to identify countries that were going to push back. And one of them was the UK. Saudi Arabia and the heavy fossil fuel producing countries, of course, are the ones who also will, as they do in the COP, put the brakes on, try to say that states do not have responsibilities to reduce emissions. On the side of the people arguing in our favour in support of our arguments, I think it'll be interesting to listen to medium BRICS countries like Brazil, for example, to see what they say. I think they could be very much, they could go either way, but I think they will go on our side. And then, of course, Bangladesh as one of the most affected countries by climate change. And some of the small island states from the Caribbean and Indian Ocean, perhaps.
Just to say to listeners who I think would know the acronym, BRICS is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I'm just reminding myself of who's who in that. Ralph, we're really grateful that you managed to make time in your very busy travel schedule, and also understand that things go up and down also in national politics in Vanuatu as well. So thank you very much for chatting to us. But before you go, we always have a few extra questions that we ask. And the first one is always, is there something that we didn't ask you that you would have liked to have had the opportunity to say?
Well, one is that it's obvious the climate crisis has been caused by the use of fossil fuels, right? So it's something for audiences in developed countries to think about the use of fossil fuels to maintain our lifestyles, our energy systems. It's something we need to recognize. It needs to stop. There needs to be a phase out. Vanuatu is one of a number of countries advocating for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. In the same way we had the nuclear weapons non-proliferation treaty, we start to treat fossil fuels as, in fact, a danger to humanity, which it is. And in all our lives, and as well as public policy, we need to start to phase out. We can't keep using excuses that we need to continue. And we do have the alternatives. We know that we have the renewable energy alternatives available to us. And if we just take the investments away from the bad, the subsidies we give to fossil fuels, which is enormous, and just turn them to the good, and trying to promote renewable energy and so on. I think that is a obvious solution that is within the hands of people and governments in the high emitting countries. And it's something I just want your audience to think about, because we are here on the other side of the world facing the brunt of the overconsumption of the developed world. And so in the principle of a global humanity, we need that to happen in the West.
Thank you very much for that. Our other final question is always, what are you reading, watching, listening to? What's in your Netflix queue? What would you recommend to our listeners? And it can be related to what we're talking about, but it could also be something that you do to get away from all of this.
Well, right now I'm reading a manuscript from a friend of mine who came to Vanuatu as a US Peace Corps volunteer many years ago. He's writing basically an autobiography of his experience, and he's asking me to check it. So I've been doing that for the last few days, which is good, because he was part of my life, and it brings back memories of what happened back then. I think I'm also enjoying Spotify. I just got on Spotify earlier this year, and it's great. I'm hearing new music, and yeah, that's and then unfortunately we've had a dissolution of Parliament, so we're going to an election. So I've got to think about that as well. And so that'll keep me busy also in the next month or so.
Understood. But to satisfy our curiosity, and apologise, we are curious journalists, what's top of your Spotify queue, or what's the collection you like? Go on, give us something. Give us an insight into Ralph's listening. Well,
my home music is always Bob Marley. And then I just listened back again to Jamiroquai's album from 1992, I think their very first album, and a bit of MC 900 Foot Jesus, or something left field.
There we go. It's the early 1990s. I feel you. Yes.
Yeah, early 1990s. That's mid 1990s is when I kind of finished my university career in Australia and came back here, so I didn't have the exposure to. So I'm sort of stuck in the past a bit.
I believe I saw recent psychological research that everybody kind of gets stuck in that period, because that, for me, I finished university in 1999. So it's like all Radiohead and Portishead for me. So yeah, you get stuck in that era, I guess. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and to walk us through this. And I hope to see you in The Hague.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Next week already.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.
If you'd like to support this podcast, please check out our Support Us page at asymmetricalhaircuts.com.
Yes, do. Buy us a coffee on Patreon. That way you also get to hear our special War Criminals Book Club recordings with our fellow international justice reporter, Molly Quell.
He steadfastly insisted that he was guilty, quote, only of aiding and abetting in the commission of the crimes with which he was charged, that he himself had never committed an overt act. And I think I could have written that sentence basically for every single defense of a suspect I have ever covered in any trial in any court for war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity.
It's often a bit of a riot.
And sometimes it's a serious discussion about books, and sometimes not, and sometimes films. And we'll pick things that portray the worlds of international courts and war crimes.
And it's only on Patreon.
Come find us there.